Bruh. Bruh. Bruh.
Hola, enfermera.
Bruh. Bruh.
Bro, what are you talking about, man?
Yeah, man. Yeah, man.
Cachorra. Cachorra.
ZconV. Gonna start in 1 minute. Wait. Wait.
En el mundo virtual nos reunimos hoy con la ZconV, el conocimiento es la voz, uniendo a todos desde el amanecer. Zcash avanza con mucho que hacer, la privacidad y la seguridad son la clave en esta conferencia donde todos tienen su llave. Desde cada rincón la comunidad se activa con ideas brillantes, la innovación se aviva. 5 días, las mentes se conectarán. Zcash unificado, juntos explorarán. Como va de guía, interacciones reales. ZconV, evento que marca idea. En el mundo virtual nos reunimos hoy con la ZconV, el conocimiento es la voz, uniendo a todos desde el amanecer. Zcash avanza con mucho que hacer, la privacidad y la seguridad son la clave en esta conferencia donde todos tienen su llave. Desde cada rincón la comunidad se activa con ideas brillantes, la innovación se aviva. 5 días, las mentes se conectarán. Zcash unificado, juntos explorarán. Como va de guía, interacciones reales. ZconV, evento que
This presentation is called To Bridge or Not to Bridge, misquoting Shakespeare, What's at Stake? And in it, I am going to attempt to do a few things, and I am not going to attempt to do a few other things. So just to describe those briefly, this presentation is sort of what I thought would be hopefully a useful elucidation of options and trade-offs related to Zcash, proof of stake, and interoperability, which are very related topics. And later on in the presentation, I'll talk about why I think they're related topics at a moderate level of detail. So this is more detailed than like to do proof of stake versus proof of work. That's not a very detailed question. This is a more detailed look at sort of what options and choices exist within proof of stake and interoperability, but it's not at the level of detail of a protocol specification. So it's sort of a mid-level of detail, and it's particularly focused on choices, which I think Zcashers kind of are still considering, as they and you consider potential possible futures involving proof of stake and interoperability. So this presentation is not an argument that Zcash should or shouldn't do X for any X. I'm just trying to clarify what the sort of options and trade-offs are, such that if you want specific features from the user perspective, hopefully this presentation will help you understand what kind of design choices at the proof of stake or interoperability protocol level impact those kinds of features, and those kinds of later on in the presentation I'll get into some of the considerations for proof of stake or economic or even almost political, and I'll get into what some of those might look like. Cool. So first I want to offer a little background just on what I mean by these terms. So proof of stake is, it's a big umbrella word, and it can mean a lot of things. And one, the original usage of the term was kind of proof of stake as contrast to proof of work. So where proof of work uses mining, uses repeated hash calculations, at least in the original formulation, to vote for particular. In some sense, it actually is a voting mechanism by hashing on a chain. You're voting for it, but to vote for particular chains, and then a fork choice rule, typically, which takes the longest chain, sometimes with some additional constraints, longest chain according to work. Proof of stake was a kind of different fork choice rule, which would take some kind of votes from stake directly, where stake is typically understood as relating to a token. So tokens are typically locked, and that becomes something called stake, and stake can be used to vote on particular chains or versions of history, and then there's some algorithm to determine which chain is chosen. And that algorithm is the fork choice algorithm, or finality. To distinguish between those two, fork choice is a property of Nakamoto chain forks, where you have multiple valid chain forks. You want to pick one of them, and whether a particular block finality is sort of the algorithm that you use to determine whether a particular block is final, as in whether you believe that it will never be reverted. Now, in Nakamoto consensus, like in Bitcoin and in the current proof of work version of Zcash, there is no finality, as in sometimes it's called probabilistic finality, or there's only a kind of probabilistic reverted argument as to why a particular block will never be reverted. But with the longest chain rule, Zcash might have, in the default client, there might be a rule to reject chains that are just too old by timestamp, I forget. But with a basic longest chain rule, there could always be a longer fork that you just don't know about. So for that reason, you don't have finality. And fork choice and finality are very coupled. I would consider them one kind of component of proof of stake. But the other component of proof of stake, and the component which has kind of, flourished in a lot of different designs in recent years, is what I call the staking and rewards mechanism. And the staking and rewards mechanism is the part of the state machine which determines how voting power is allocated to public keys. So ultimately, in consensus, in some kind of BFT consensus, where you're sending around votes, the votes are signed messages. They're signed by public keys, and the votes have some kind of voting power associated with them. And voting power is not just as simple as tokens, right? So if you have some tokens, those will correspond to voting power in some way, but often the way is a bit more intricate than just like one token equals one voting power. For example, you might need to lock the tokens first in delegations or bonds. You might need to register as a validator. There might be limitations on how that gets accomplished. It's even possible, although rare, I think, but it's possible to use different rates for allocating voting power to tokens. There's a lot of design choice. There are a lot of design choices and just a lot of design space there. And the rewards mechanism determines how the rewards, so whatever kind of portion of inflation and fees is dedicated for proof of stake, are paid to validators and delegators if the system supports delegation. And many of the questions of how you should pay rewards are kind of economic or crypto economic questions, and they don't necessarily have clear objective answers. So later on in the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about those. But I want to distinguish or kind of split proof of stake into these two main components, particularly because so far I think Zcash is focused mostly on fork choice and finality, both because Zcash was historically proof of work and because so far, at least the research that I've read into proof of stake within the Zcash ecosystem has really been focused on that component. And that component is important. It's critical, it's required if you want to move to proof of stake, but it's also not the whole picture, and it's, I would even say, like, maybe only half the work. So for that reason, I will focus most of this presentation on the second component with regards to proof of stake. Now, to give a little bit of background on interoperability, by interoperability, I mean potentially different things, but at minimum, the ability to move Zec or Zcash to and from other chains in a decentralized fashion. So I include decentralized fashion because technically you could already do a kind of interoperability with some single central entity. Like if I decide to issue an ERC20 token and I call it ERC Zcash, and I promise to give you one Zcash if you send me one ERC Zcash, then in some sense I've created an interoperability protocol between Ethereum and Zcash, but for good reason. You might not trust that kind of protocol because you have to trust specifically me. So I'm going to talk about more decentralized methods of interoperability. Now, depending on what Zcash also does in the future, interoperability is something that really happens at the chain level. So once you have interoperability between Zcash and other blockchains, you could probably easily add interoperability for other things happening on Zcash and the other blockchains. For example, if Zcash adds support for ZSAs, Zcash shielded assets in the future, which I understand Kedit is working on, then ZSAs could easily be moved back and forth to other chains, with the same kind of basic interoperability as would support doing that with just Zec. If there are more complex, programmable ZSAs or other kinds of more complex applications on Zcash, those could also use, pass messages to and from other chains, which aren't just tokens. That's what I mean by interoperability. Now, you might ask, why consider proof of stake and interoperability together in one function? The basic reason is that interoperability requires finality. In order for other chains to interact with your chain, they need to know when they can treat a particular block, and state transitions referenced in that block, including tokens, stuff like this, is final. Proof of stake, and from the kind of consensus or fork choice finality perspective, provides a clear finality rule. Typically, it's also typically cheap to verify, whereas verifying proof of work, there's some more efficient like clients like Fly Client, but proof of stake is generally much more efficient to verify than proof of work because you just need to check some signatures. For this reason, proof of stake and interoperability are often very related, and if you look at the ecosystem of protocols out in the world, you'll notice that they tend to come in pairs, as in there tends to be a specific proof of stake design associated with a specific interoperability design. So in the Cosmos ecosystem, there's bonded proof of stake and the Cosmos SDK, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, and IBC. In Avalanche, there's staking and subnets. So these protocols are, kind of related there. And I think it probably makes sense for Zcash. This is maybe the only normative statement in this presentation. I think Zcash should consider these aspects in tandem. It would be probably much more awkward to think about proof of stake and interoperability separately. That's, some other older projects have done that, like, Ethereum, for example, considered proof of stake and interoperability separately. And I think, all else remaining the same, that's probably made their life harder. So it would be easier for Zcash to consider these two aspects in tandem. So I just want to offer a kind of user-facing overview of what proof of stake will probably change from Zcash today. So one thing that will change is consensus security. In proof of work, of course, security is provided by miners. In proof of stake, security is provided by validators, or at least partially validators who are issuing the signatures. Now, in some hybrid designs, such as the trailing finality layer, which has been proposed by the Electric Coin Company, that's a hybrid design featuring both proof of work and proof of stake. So security is provided by both of these parties. For more details on how that works, I would refer you to the trailing finality layer book, or I believe that Dara is also giving a presentation at the ZCon about the topic. The operator roles will change. So in a sort of gradual transition, mining will be gradually phased out, or in an immediate proof of stake transition, it would be phased out all in one go, like Ethereum did. staking will become possible. Now, where mining is basically one role, like either you're mining or you're not, staking tends to contain at least two roles, those of validation and delegation. To summarize briefly, validation is signing blocks, publishing signatures. That requires an online node, tends to be more professionalized. You need to run a server that's on the network all the time, processing blocks, validating them, issuing signatures. And delegation is usually something which is much more kind of open to users who aren't online all the time and perhaps don't want to run nodes. And they can, using protocols which in this case would presumably be Zec, and basically delegate that stake to a validator who gains voting power kind of the user's stake. The user delegates it to the validator and they gain the ability to vote on the user's behalf, or so to speak. Yes, there are kind of two roles typically in proof of stake protocols, whereas there's really only one in mining that has economic significance to the protocol. The other consideration for operators is that really mining and operating a validator are very different from a kind of security perspective, from a what you need to do perspective, from a business perspective. Slashing is possible in proof of stake when you run a validator. There are different kinds of distribution logic. So regardless of the specifics of the change, Zec, newly issued Zec, will no longer just go to miners. Some of it will have to go to the validators, and it might also go from the validators to delegators. So there will be some changes in how Zec is distributed, and there are a lot of specific decisions to be made there. So I want to answer the same question from the perspective of interoperability. What will interoperability change from Zcash today? Well, at minimum, Zec will be able to be sent to other chains as back. And on those other chains, Zec could be used in other applications. For example, on Osmosis, which is a DEX in the Cosmos ecosystem, Zec could be swapped to and from ETH, Atom, USDC, or any other asset on Osmosis. If there are stablecoin vaults, there are many of those in Cosmos, Ethereum, and other ecosystems. Zec could be locked as collateral if someone is willing to accept it. The one thing which I think is cool is that Zec could be held by DAOs on other chains or by kind of other multi-signatures or other accounts who might wish to kind of hold it there because they have their custody set up there or want to use it in different programmable ways, which are not possible to do on the Zcash chain. Now, if Zcash adds other features such as CSAs, then these other Zcash consensus and state machine history just in general can be verified on other chains. Different developers could build applications which take advantage of that. For example, applications which do something if you send a transaction on Zcash, or applications which aggregate statistics from the Zcash chain over time, stuff like this. So now I want to dive in specifically into proof of stake. So as a refresher, earlier I talked about the two independent components of proof of stake. The first, oops, there's a slight typo there, but finality and the fork choice rule, and the second, staking and rewards mechanism. Now I want to talk about those in more detail in turn. So fork choice and finality. The fork choice and finality rules, as a refresher, determine when full nodes will consider a block final and which fork they might pick amongst a selection of valid chains. Now, I think so far the Zcash ecosystem has done the most research into this part of proof of stake. In particular, the Electric Coin Company has conducted a bunch of really awesome research into something they call the trailing finality layer, which provides both of these aspects initially as a hybrid proof of work and proof of stake protocol with a planned eventual transition to pure proof of stake. The proposed protocol is described in quite sort of detailed language at this URL. And I believe the presentation will also be happening about that at CCon. Now, most of the details, at least the details which are specified in this book, are independent from the staking and rewards mechanism, as in these details assume that there are some public keys and they have voting power, which is chosen somehow. And then this book describes how you would implement the kind of consensus logic and fork choice finality rules given that allocation of voting power. But at least so far, there's not a lot of detail here as to how that voting power is actually allocated to public keys, how staking and delegation work, stuff like this. So I tried to kind of canvas the history of discourse in Zcash, and I'm sure that I've done so imperfectly. I can't read everything, but I tried to canvas the history of Zcash for stated preferences about the staking and rewards mechanism, because there are a lot of choices here. I found a few presentations which went into a little bit of detail, some by Nathan Wilcox, past Zcons, discussing a kind of desire to support delegation. Not all proof-of-stake protocols support delegation. Some of them don't, or some of them do it out of protocols. This is a choice. You don't have to do it. And there's a desire for easy entry of new validators. And then the ECC's TFL book there's a section listing goals and non-goals, and a few of them are relevant, although they're kind of high level. One stated goal is that the protocol should enable users of shielded mobile wallets to delegate ZAC to POS consensus providers, and earn, i.e. validators, and earn a return on that ZAC coming via ZAC issuance or fees. Doing this may expose users to a risk of loss of delegated ZAC, such as through slashing. The protocol must guarantee that proof-of-stake consensus providers have no discretionary control over such delegated funds, including that they cannot steal those funds. So this implies in-protocol support for delegation as opposed to like out-of-protocol support. And some stated non-goals in that TFL book are in-protocol liquid staking derivatives. I'll talk a little bit more about what those are later. And maximizing the staked voter, or I think they mean validator count ceiling. So these are kind of what I understand as some articulated preferences in the Zcash community, and I'm sure there are others. I'm also not entirely sure whether this goal is intended to refer specifically to shielded mobile wallets as opposed to other wallets. I'm going to assume that it's referring to just people who hold ZAC in general, but especially including users of shielded mobile wallets, as in it shouldn't require running a full node. But I assume that people in order to kind of provide some useful examples here, I thought it would be useful to talk about some staking and rewards subsystems or proof-of-stake subsystems which exist in the world and what is different about them and how those differences might be relevant to things which the Zcash community cares about. So there are a lot of examples. The good news about implementing proof-of-stake at this point in time is that many people have done versions of it in the world, and many of those versions have actually been deployed in practice and run for many years. So you can see not only the technical implications or like basic security implications, i.e. have these systems forked. That's like a very basic security implication. But you can also see the kind of some of the socio-political implications. And one thing about proof of stake that is quite different than proof of work and that I think is sort of important for the Zcash community to consider is that it really has very different socio-political structure. So in proof of work, the entities performing the role of kind of providing consensus security miners are anonymous. They don't care about maintaining a reputation because it has nothing to do with their returns. They just need to mine as efficiently as possible and as fast as possible. And they typically aren't necessarily very integrated into the community structure. They're often kind of solo mining operators. Sometimes they might want to be anonymous for reasons of preventing denial of service or reasons of legality. But also just there's no reason for them to participate in the community. They don't gain any material benefits from doing so, at least not as relates to running miners. And mining operations just tend to be competing on the basis of hardware, right? In proof of stake, however, validators, at least in systems where validators are competing for delegations, validators are really competing on the basis of reputation, which means that they often end up doing other things, as in they often end up building or operating wallets, building or operating additional software. Sometimes they host conferences. They often end up involved in the community in other ways because they benefit from doing so, because doing so exposes their brand to users who might delegate and kind of demonstrate some level of commitment to the project, which delegators often might take into consideration when they make decisions about who to delegate to. So one kind of thing that I encourage the Zcash community to do is to think about what kind of social structure you might want, particularly what kind of relationships between validators and delegators you might want. Study existing ecosystems, both how they implement proof of stake and what kinds of these relationships have developed in those ecosystems, kind of use that data to make an informed decision for Zcash's design and community goals. And some of the specific decisions here, how many validators are there? How does the commission, how do things like commission work? How do rewards work? These really affect the socio-political structure because they affect, are validators competing or collaborating? Are there a lot of them or a few of them? Are there sort of, how easy is it for individuals to run a validator versus are they almost always delegators? Are delegations often intermediated by things like liquid staking, etc.? So I'm going to cover 4 examples from other ecosystems here. I will cover Ethereum, the staking and rewards mechanism in Ethereum. I'll cover the staking and rewards mechanism in the Cosmos SDK used by most Cosmos chains. I'll cover the staking and rewards mechanism in Penumbra, at least according to the latest version of their protocol spec. And I'll cover the staking and rewards mechanism in Nomada, which is a project that I work on. There are a bunch of other examples that I think would be interesting that I won't cover here just due to lack of time. I think Avalanche, Tezos, Solana, and Polkadot all have kind of interesting and different proof-of-stake mechanisms and interesting and different, socio-political, community, and economic structures. They're probably worth studying. First, I want to talk about Ethereum. So Ethereum implements a version. All of the other examples here use Tendermint. So Ethereum does not use Tendermint. Ethereum uses Casper. It implements a much different proof of stake, both a different fork choice and finality rule and a different staking and rewards mechanism. In particular, the kind of trade-off that Ethereum takes is that finality is slower, but they support many more validators, where only a subset of validators sign each block. These validators in Ethereum must lock at least 32 ETH. They have withdrawal logic, which is configurable with smart contracts. I believe that it's quadratic, but at least correlated slashing for faults, meaning that if multiple different validators commit faults that are discovered within a similar time frame, the slash rate increases. This is designed to kind of encourage decorrelation and some more decentralization. At least recently, liquid staking or proof of stake derivatives have become very common in Ethereum, particularly Lido. These are implemented with smart contracts. And an important thing to understand as it relates to socio-political structure in the context of liquid staking is that liquid staking providers, they provide an important service for delegators. Part of that service is the access to a liquid token that you can do other things with. Part of that service is validator selection. So one thing in proof of stake protocols in the world, in kind of the world right now, that I would argue typically doesn't work very well in practice, is that evaluating validators is difficult, right? In order to evaluate the security of the validator, in order to evaluate how much they contribute to the ecosystem, all of these other things that you might want to evaluate as a delegator, you need a lot of information and a lot of time. And you need like specialized knowledge of validator setups and how to tell good ones from bad ones. And you need a lot of knowledge of the community and ecosystem structure and what the validator is doing for, in this case, Zcash. And this is just like, this evaluation is very expensive. So it's hard for individual delegators, especially if they only have a small amount of Zec, and don't necessarily, it doesn't make sense to them to commit a lot of time to these kinds of discussions and research. They often don't really know who they should delegate to. And one service that liquid staking providers such as Lido provide is that they, because they're of course kind of central entities, they can spend a lot of time evaluating validators, quote unquote, on behalf of users of their liquidity token. So I think this is something, something interesting for Zcash to consider is what you want your relationship to liquid staking to be. It's not necessarily entirely something which is only decided by Zcash, as in even if the protocol doesn't support it, like the Ethereum protocol doesn't support liquid staking, it just supports smart contracts. And lots of other parties, such as Lido, built liquid staking on top of that using smart contracts. Now, Zcash, the blockchain doesn't support smart contracts, but probably eventually Zcash will become interoperable with other chains, so people could build liquid staking systems on other chains. Or even if that doesn't happen, people can use threshold cryptography and validator multisigs, and they can still build liquid staking systems. So it's probably impossible to stop. And I think that the more kind of salient question is just what kind of economic relationship do you want your protocol to have to it, and do you want it to happen sooner and within control of the protocol, or later and probably out of the control of the protocol. And in the Ethereum staking and reward system, which is kind of relevant for implementation concerns, is implemented in Ethereum clients, which are available in lots of different languages. So now I'll talk about the staking and reward system in the Cosmos SDK. In the Cosmos SDK, Cosmos implements something called bonded proof of stake. So there are a few hundred validators because all or most of those validators sign each block, and they all have to send messages to each other in Tendermint, comment. So the number must be relatively small. Because the number is small, and because they all or most sign each block, finality is very quick, measured in terms typically of seconds, like 5 seconds. Now you must typically, or in the Cosmos SDK, you must be in the top N, like 150, a few hundred validators by stake to be a validator. So most users cannot be a validator. They just don't have enough stake. Instead, however, they can delegate to validators. The Cosmos SDK supports instant redelegation, so if you don't like your current validator, you can choose a new one without waiting. Validators take some commission. I think the typical ranges right now are 5 to 10%, but the rest of the rewards go to the users who delegated to them. And in the Cosmos SDK, all of this commission and rewards logic, including rewards going back to the users, is protocol enforced. So to go back to kind of the goal here articulated by the TFL book, I believe this implementation or this design satisfies this goal, as in the validators in Cosmos do not have discretionary control over such delegated funds, and the protocol enforces that the users get the rewards that the validators earn less the commission. Now, the Cosmos SDK also does not implement liquid staking, but in the Cosmos ecosystem, liquid staking has been implemented by other chains, particularly one called Stride, using IBC. And the Cosmos SDK is implemented in Go. Another example I want to talk about is Penumbra. Penumbra also uses Tendermint, so there are a few hundred validators, all or most of which sign each block. Fast finality measured in seconds. You must be in the top end stake to be a validator. Same things there because it's using Tendermint. Now, what Penumbra does that's quite different from the Cosmos SDK is that it implements native liquid staking. So in Penumbra, each validator has their own liquid staking token. These are tradable. They can be exchanged. When you delegate to a validator, you receive the LST, and you can send the LST back to the protocol, or so to speak, to undelegate it after a period of time. Now, these undelegations are rate limited in a queue. For full details there, see the Penumbra protocol spec, and this is implemented, as far as I know, in Rust. And the last example, now Penumbra is not live yet, so there's no ecosystem to study here. There's only an ecosystem to study for Ethereum and Cosmos. The last example I'll talk about here is Namada. Namada is also using Tendermint. It's not implemented in Go, it's implemented in Rust. The system is pretty similar to the one in the Cosmos SDK. There's delegation, there's bonding, instant redelegation, there's commission enforced by the protocol. But one difference is that the Namada does cubic slashing, which is like quadratic slashing, but instead of quadratic, it's cubic. So there's even like less penalty for uncorrelated faults and more penalty for correlated faults. And Namada is also not yet live, but one thing which might be interesting to the Zcash community is that this is implemented in Rust, which is probably the language that Zcash would use, at least from what I understand from the current client implementations. Okay, so I've gone through some of the details here, just to kind of summarize some takeaways that I think might be important to consider the Zcash ecosystem. One, the fork choice rule is only half the battle. I think there's a lot of discussion, that I see on the forums and in presentations on proof of work security versus proof of stake security, and that discussion is very important, but it's not sufficient in order to actually have a proof of stake system. You also need to figure out what you want for the staking and rewards mechanism, and I think this could be difficult because a lot of the decisions made in the staking and rewards mechanisms they're not really objective, or they're you can do very clear kind of discrete security analysis of fork choice rules. There's a lot of that in the TFL book, but a lot of these decisions, made here in the staking and rewards mechanisms are kind of, they relate more to the socio-political structure. How do you want delegation to work? How do you want rewards to go around? Which entities are you willing to endow with some additional trust in the operation of the protocol? Which are you not? Do you want faster finality or more validators? I would understand these as more, socio-political, socioeconomic questions. They're not just protocol security questions. Another takeaway is sometimes people say just use Tendermint, and I think that that's well-intentioned but too simple in this case. All of these example systems would require substantial changes. Even if Zcash just used Tendermint for the BFT consensus part, all of these example kind of staking and reward systems would require quite a bit of work in order to be used with the current Zcash state machine and code base, and it's not clear that any of them exactly satisfy the Zcash community's requirements. You might also just want to design your own and pick and choose pieces from these different mechanisms. And these finer details and choices really affect, decentralization and the distribution of power within the community. Validators care about reputation, as I mentioned, and you can probably mine these existing ecosystems for a bunch of valuable practical data on how proof of stake has affected their trajectories. some choices to kind of take away that, I think are still to be made. How do you want delegation of rewards to work? Do you want the protocol to enforce reward distribution to delegators, or should validators do this on their own? How do you want slashing to work? Do you want liquid staking inside the protocol, outside of the protocol? If it's outside of the protocol, do you expect it to happen and you're just fine with that? Or do you want to try and prevent it? And how do you prevent it? That's very difficult because, as I mentioned before, there's kind of a real service being provided that a lot of delegators find to be valuable. Another question which I haven't seen discussed so much so far is who might the validators be in the Zcash ecosystem? I think many validators in Zcash might come from the existing ecosystem. It's not like miners are very mercenary. They switch from chain to chain in accordance with what's more profitable. They'll come to Zcash if Zcash is profitable with their hardware, and they'll leave. It's not. Whereas validators tend to be much more embedded in the long-term structure of a community. So I think it would be interesting to figure out, who some of these validators might be and what kind of relationships with delegators they want and what relationships the delegators want. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about interoperability. There are two main options. One, implement IBC in Zcash, and two, use a bespoke bridge, which would need to add Zcash support. So IBC. IBC is the interoperability protocol originally developed by Cosmos. It's now supported pretty much everywhere, or at least it will be by the time Zcash would implement it. The big advantage of IBC is that it really minimizes the trust assumptions required for interoperability. Implementations are available in Go and Rust. In order to implement IBC, Zcash must do basically two things. One, there needs to be an efficient light client, and two, Zcash needs to integrate IBC code into the state machine. The second option is a bespoke bridge. A bespoke bridge basically means that some other chain and validator set runs Zcash nodes, and the validators of that chain run a multi-signature account on the Zcash chain. So in this sort of bridge architecture, there are two sides. There's the Zcash side and there's the bridge side. Sending from Zcash to the bridge chain just entails sending Zec to the multi-sig on the Zcash side. Then the validators will confirm that send, and they'll mint some kind of Zec voucher on the bridge side, and to send back, you burn Zec vouchers on the bridge side, and then the validators will send a Zec from the multisig on the Zcash side to whatever address you specify. So we made a proposal for potentially doing this with Namada, which goes into this architecture into some more detail, and you could find that on the forums. So I want to talk about the trade-offs between these two options. The big advantage of IBC is that there are no additional trust assumptions beyond the chains involved, and once you've implemented IBC, it's inexpensive and quick. From a user perspective, as in you can send very quickly from one chain to another, and you don't have to pay additional fees to some bridge operator. The disadvantage of IBC is that it might take a long time to implement. It's at least dependent on proof of stake, and depending on the details of proof of stake, especially like client and state machine integration, it might require additional work. The bespoke bridge adds an additional trust assumption in the bridge operator set, at least for transfers. Beyond that bridge, if you're just transferring to the other chain, it's not an additional assumption. But if you want to transfer beyond, it is compared to IBC. The advantage of the bespoke bridge is that it could be much faster to implement because it's not dependent on proof of stake. Although the bridge operators must pick some kind of finality rule for when they determine a block to be final for the perspective of sending coins to the other side of the bridge. Now, Zcash could choose to do both. There could be a bespoke bridge now, and Zcash could switch to IBC later. In some sense, it's the best of both worlds, but it does require more work. Okay, what's next? I just want to talk a little bit about, kind of what we're working on and what kinds of collaborations we're looking for. One other thing, which is not relevant to the rest of the content of this presentation, but we as Namada are working on shielded airdrop to Zec. There's a technical thread with some of the details that I've linked there. If you have sort of technical feedback, we'd love to hear back from you. We just heard back from the ECC yesterday. Thank you everyone at the ECC for a really comprehensive response, and we're working on now understanding and responding to that. We'd also love to hear from other people who have technical thoughts, and there's a separate thread for kind of non-technical thoughts. We are very open to developing a bespoke bridge on Namada, and we're also open to offering grants and assistance to someone who wants to do this. We are also open to supporting a proof of stake and IBC implementation on Zcash. If other entities are working on that, we're happy to help them. We have some proof of stake and IBC experience. That's something we can offer. We could offer some engineering assistance. We could offer some design assistance. We are also willing to help directly. In order to do that, we need a much clearer understanding of what the Zcash community wants in some of these specific areas, kind of hence this presentation. And we've kind of hesitated on committing to an avenue in one of these two options because we really think the Zcash community specific proof of stake plans make a difference. As in, if proof of stake is something that will be done, pretty soon, then a bespoke bridge doesn't make a lot of sense. If proof of stake in IBC are going to take a long time or kind of still under discussion, then a bespoke bridge in the short term might make more sense. So we're kind of still collecting information there. We're open to all of these avenues. Specifically, we're interested in kind of collecting further Zcash community feedback on what kind of staking and rewards mechanism people want, whether people would use a bespoke bridge or whether you would prefer to wait until Zcash integrates proof of stake and IBC support, and which potential benefits and uses of interoperability are most interesting to you. Questions, I think, will come asynchronously since I'm pre-recording this. And thank you very much. If you want to contact me, of course, I'll be around in the application, the ConferenceHuva conference app for questions. And you can also reach me by email, on Twitter, or on the Zcash community forums. Thank you.